April 5th, 1242. Lake Peipus. The ice stretched for miles in every direction, a vast white plain beneath a pale grey sky. Spring had not yet come to the borderlands between east and west, and the lake remained locked in winter's grip, thick enough to bear the weight of armies, but only just. On the western shore, banners bearing white crosses fluttered in the bitter wind. The Livonian order had come in force, hundreds of knights in full armour, mounted and magnificent, the tip of Christendom's crusading spear driving eastward into the Orthodox lands. They had conquered Estonian territories, they had built stone fortresses, they had baptized with steel and blood. Now they had come for Novgorod itself, the great merchant republic, the last barrier between Germanic power and the vast Russian interior. Across the ice, on the eastern shore, stood a different kind of army. No heavy cavalry here, but lighter horsemen and infantry, Novgorodians, Sesdalians, common soldiers drawn from the towns and countryside. At their head rode Prince Alexander Yaroslavich, not yet 30 years old, already a legend for his victory over the Swedes at the Neva River 2 years prior. He was outnumbered. His men wore lighter armour. His resources paled beside the wealth and military tradition of the order. But he had chosen this ground. He had drawn the knights onto the ice, and he had one advantage they did not. He knew this land, this lake, this treacherous borderland where water became stone and stone became water with the changing seasons. The fate of Russia hung in the balance. If the knights won here, Novgorod would fall. The Orthodox heartland would lie open. If they lost, and the crusading expansion would shatter against the ice. What happened next would be remembered for centuries, as the day the lake itself became a weapon. For decades, the Baltic had been a frontier of faith and conquest. The Teutonic order and its northern cousin, the Livonian order, were warrior monks, knights who had taken vows of poverty and obedience, but whose mission was neither prayer nor charity. Their purpose was conversion and conquest. Where the cross did not persuade, the sword would compel. They had carved out dominions in Prussia and Livonia, building stone castles amid pagan forests, establishing trading posts along amber-rich coasts, and slowly, methodically, extending Catholic power into the wild northeastern frontiers of Europe. This was the age of the Northern Crusades, a holy war waged not in the sun-baked deserts of the Levant, but in the cold forests and marshlands of the Baltic. Pagan tribes had been subjugated or exterminated. Estonian lands had fallen. The order's ambitions now turned toward the Orthodox Christian principalities of Russia, which they regarded as schismatics, heretics, little better than pagans. To the knights, this was righteous work, bringing the true faith to benighted peoples, expanding Christendom's borders, and, not incidentally, acquiring wealth, land, and tribute in the process. Novgorod was the prize. One of the oldest and wealthiest cities in Russia, it sat astride crucial trade routes connecting the Baltic to the Byzantine world. It was a republic governed by an assembly of merchants and nobles, independent and proud, some reliant not on royal bloodlines but on commerce and cunning. For the Livonian order, Novgorod represented not just territory but legitimacy. The capture of such a city would prove that God favored their enterprise, that the Eastern Orthodox lands were ripe for absorption into the Latin world. But Novgorod was not defenseless. The Republic had invited Alexander Yaroslavich, Prince of Vladimir Suzdal, to serve as its military commander. Alexander was young, but he had already proven himself a warrior and strategist of rare ability. Just 2 years earlier, in 1240, he had defeated a Swedish invasion force at the Neva River, a stunning victory that had earned him the epithet Nevski. The Swedes had come seeking to establish a fortress near the mouth of the Neva, threatening Novgorod's northern trade routes. Alexander had struck fast, taking the fight to them before they could fortify their position, and had shattered their army in a single, brutal engagement. The victory had been complete. The Swedish commander fell wounded, his army retreated in disarray, and the threat from the north evaporated. Now the threat came from the west. The Livonian order, seeing the chaos among the Russian principalities, many weakened by Mongol invasions from the east, judged the moment ripe for conquest. In 1240, while Alexander was still dealing with the Swedes, the knights had moved against the fortress city of Pskov, Novgorod's southern sister. Pskov fell through treachery. A faction within the city opened the gates, and the order walked in without a fight. From Pskov, they pushed deeper, raiding toward Novgorod itself, burning villages, seizing tribute, and establishing a foothold in Russian territory. Alexander could not allow it. If Pskov remained in enemy hands, Novgorod would be strangled. The Republic's southern trade routes would be severed, its heartland exposed. He rallied the Novgorodian militia and whatever forces he could muster from allied principalities. In the winter of 1241, he marched south and retook Pskov in a lightning campaign, expelling the Germanic garrison and reasserting Novgorod's authority. The order was surprised, but not broken. Their main army, hundreds of knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, remained in the field. Retreat was not in their vocabulary. They would meet Alexander in open battle, crush his makeshift army, and reassert their dominance over these eastern borderlands. Both sides prepared for a decisive confrontation. For the Livonian order, this was a crusade ordained by God, a righteous war against schismatics who refused Rome's authority. For Alexander and the men of Novgorod, it was a fight for survival, for independence, for the very soul of Russia. The battlefield they would choose was Lake Peipus, a vast frozen expanse on the border between conquered and free territory, between Latin Christendom and Orthodox Russia. Neither side could afford to lose. And on the morning of April 5th, 1242, as dawn broke over the ice, both knew that only one would walk away. Alexander Nevsky understood something fundamental about his enemy. Their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. The Livonian knights were the most formidable heavy cavalry in Europe. Clad head to toe in mail and plate, mounted on powerful war horses, bred for shock and endurance. They fought in disciplined formations that could shatter infantry lines like a hammer through glass. On open ground, in a straightforward clash, they were nearly invincible. Lightly armored Russian horsemen and town militia could not stand against them in a conventional battle. So Alexander decided not to fight a conventional battle. He chose the ice of Lake Peipus as his battlefield. It was early April, the cusp of spring. The lake was still frozen, but the ice was no longer the iron-hard surface of midwinter. It had been weakening for weeks, thinning under the sun's lengthening warmth, fracturing along unseen fault lines. For a man on foot, it was still solid. For a lightly armored horseman, it held, but for a fully armored knight on a heavy war horse, carrying perhaps 200 pounds of steel and weaponry, that was a different question. Alexander knew the lake. He had fished these waters, crossed this ice in winters past. He knew where the currents ran beneath, where the ice was weakest, where the lake bed dropped away into cold, dark depths. The Livonian commanders, foreigners to this land, knew none of this. They saw only a flat, open expanse, perfect terrain for cavalry, a killing ground where their discipline and armor would overwhelm the numerically inferior Russians. They marched onto the ice without hesitation. Alexander deployed his forces carefully. He positioned his infantry, men from Novgorod and the surrounding principalities, armed with spears, axes, and shields, in the center, along the eastern shore, where the ice met the land. These were not professional soldiers, but they were stubborn and knew what was at stake. Behind them, hidden among the forested shoreline, Alexander placed his cavalry, mounted archers and medium horsemen, ready to strike once the battle was joined. The plan was simple, but required nerve. Let the knights charge, absorb their impact with the infantry, then hit them from the flanks and rear before they could regroup. And if the ice cooperated, if it gave way beneath the weight of armored horses and steel-clad men, so much the better. The Livonian order advanced in their traditional formation, the wedge. It was a terrifying sight. Ranks of knights packed tightly together, forming a pointed spearhead of steel and horseflesh, designed to punch through enemy lines and create chaos. At the tip rode the most experienced warriors, veterans of a dozen campaigns. Behind them came wave after wave of mounted sergeants and allied Estonian auxiliaries. Their banners streamed in the wind, white crosses stark against the grey sky. War cries echoed across the frozen lake, prayers in Latin mingling with the drumbeat of hooves on ice. From the Russian lines, there was only silence. Alexander had ordered his men to hold, to wait, to let the enemy come. Some shifted nervously, gripping their weapons tighter. Others whispered prayers to St. Alexander of the Neva, to the Virgin Mary, to any saint who might hear. The knights were coming, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, only the ice beneath their feet and the will to stand. The distance closed. 500 yards. 300. The sound grew louder, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very air. This was the moment when armies broke, when men turned and fled rather than face the oncoming avalanche of iron and rage. But the Russians held. Alexander had positioned himself at the front, visible to all, his banner flying above him. If he would not run, then neither would they. 100 yards. The world narrowed to the wedge of knights driving toward them, to the glint of sunlight on steel, to the frozen breath rising from horses' nostrils. And then, in the final seconds before impact, Alexander gave the order. The archers among the infantry loosed their arrows, not to kill, armor deflected most, but to unnerve, to disrupt, to force the knights to raise their shields and narrow their vision. And then the wedge struck. The collision was catastrophic. Knights slammed into the Russian line with all the force of their charge, lances punching through shields, horses trampling men who could not move fast enough. The sound was deafening, metal on metal, its screams of wounded, the wet crunch of bodies breaking beneath hooves. For a moment, it seemed the line would shatter. Men staggered backward, gaps opened, and the wedge began to drive deeper. But the Russians did not break. They bent, absorbed the impact, and closed ranks around the knights like water flowing around stones. These were not the disciplined formations of Western Europe, trained to fight in neat rows. These were desperate men defending their homes, and they fought with the ferocity of the cornered. Spears jabbed upward at horses' bellies and riders' faces. Axes hooked shields and dragged knights from their saddles. The momentum of the charge began to slow, the wedge bogging down in the chaos of close combat. And that was when Alexander's cavalry struck. From both flanks, Russian horsemen erupted from their concealment, pouring onto the ice in a thundering arc that encircled the Livonian flanks. These were not heavily armored knights. They wore mail at best, some only leather and furs, but they were fast, and they were many. Mounted archers fired into the packed ranks of the order, aiming for horses and the gaps in armor. Lighter cavalry closed with swords and axes, targeting the already engaged knights from the sides and rear. The wedge, designed to break through and scatter an enemy, was now trapped. Knights who had been driving forward suddenly found themselves surrounded, their formation compressed and immobile. Horses reared and screamed. Orders were shouted in German and Latin, but in the noise and confusion, no one could hear. No one could obey. The discipline that had carried them across the ice began to fracture. Some knights tried to wheel around to face the flanking horsemen. Others pressed forward, still believing they could break through the infantry and escape. The formation collapsed into a swirling melee, where the advantage of heavy armor became a liability. Knights could not move quickly, could not retreat, could only stand and fight as the Russians swarmed over them. And then the ice began to crack. At first it was just a sound, a low, ominous groan beneath the chaos of battle, felt more than heard. Then a sharp crack, like the snap of a tree branch, but louder, deeper. Men looked down in sudden fear. Beneath the press of hundreds of armored horses and fighting men, beneath the stamping and crashing and weight of steel, the ice was failing. Fractures spider-webbed outward from the thickest fighting, the dark lines racing across the white surface. Water began to seep through, black and cold, pooling around the hooves of panicked horses. The knights realized too late what was happening. Those at the center of the wedge, the most heavily armored, bore the greatest weight. Their war horses, bred for strength but not for delicate footing, shifted nervously as the surface beneath them buckled and cracked. Some tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The formation was too tightly packed, the melee too chaotic. And then, with a thunderous crack that echoed across the lake, a section of ice gave way. A dozen knights vanished in an instant. One moment they were fighting, the next they were plunging into freezing water, dragged down by the weight of their armor. Horses thrashed and screamed, their eyes wide with terror. But the mail and plate that protected them in battle now became death sentences. Men clawed at the ice, trying to pull themselves out, but their gloves found no purchase on the slick surface. Some managed to shed their helmets, gasping for air, but the cold was unbearable, sapping strength within seconds. Most simply disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the black water and pulled down into the depths of Lake Peipus. Panic spread faster than fire. Knights who moments before had been fighting with grim determination now scrambled to escape the disintegrating ice. The wedge shattered completely, men turning their horses and fleeing westward toward the far shore and safety. But the ice was breaking all around them now. Every step, every movement seemed to trigger new fractures. More men fell through. Our entire sections of the formation collapsed into the freezing water. The Russians, lighter and more spread out, backed away from the crumbling center, letting the lake do what their weapons could not. Alexander ordered the pursuit. His cavalry rode hard after the fleeing knights, cutting down those who could not escape fast enough, harrying them across the ice toward the western shore. Some knights made it to solid ground and continued fleeing into the forests beyond. Others were caught on the ice itself, surrounded and forced to surrender or die. A few chose to fight to the end, dismounting and making hopeless stands on the frozen lake. But they were overwhelmed and killed where they stood. The battle lasted perhaps 2 hours from first contact to final pursuit, but it felt like an eternity. By the time the fighting ended, the ice was littered with bodies, shattered weapons, broken banners. Patches of open water marked where the lake had claimed its victims. Blood stained the white surface, and the groans of the wounded echoed in the sudden terrible silence. The Livonian order had been shattered. Estimates would vary. Some chronicles claimed hundreds of knights killed, others more modest numbers. But there was no dispute about the outcome. The crusade against Novgorod was over. The survivors straggled back to their fortresses in Livonia, defeated and humiliated, their invincibility shattered on the ice of Lake Peipus. They had lost perhaps 50 knights captured and led away as prisoners, a devastating blow to an order that measured its full brother knights in the hundreds. The auxiliaries and allied Estonian troops who had marched with them were scattered or dead. Alexander stood on the eastern shore as the sun set that evening, watching as his men gathered the wounded and salvaged what they could from the battlefield. Some soldiers ventured cautiously onto the ice, retrieving weapons and armor, though they gave wide berth to the places where the lake had opened. Bodies would remain there, encased in ice or sunk to the lake bed for years to come. The lake had become a grave, and it would hold its dead for a long time. The prince said little. He had won a great victory, preserved Novgorod's independence, and proven that the armored might of the Western orders could be defeated. But he knew the cost. Men of his own army lay among the dead, and the victory had been as much the lake's doing as his own tactics. But he had gambled, and the ice had held just long enough for his plan to work. If the knights had come a week earlier, when the freeze was still solid, or a week later, when the lake had fully thawed, the outcome might have been very different. But they had come when they came, and the ice had spoken. In the days following the battle, Alexander's men marched the captured knights back to Novgorod in a grim procession. The common people lined the streets to watch as the proud warriors of the Livonian order were paraded through the city, stripped of their weapons and banners, their armor dented and bloodied. It was a deliberate humiliation, a message to anyone who might doubt Novgorod's resolve. The Crusaders could be beaten, the expansion could be stopped, and the Orthodox heartland would not fall without a fight. The prisoners would eventually be ransomed or exchanged, but their presence in Novgorod served a purpose beyond ransom gold. They were proof of victory, tangible evidence that the seemingly unstoppable order was not invincible. Merchants and nobles who had wavered, who had considered whether it might be safer to submit to the Germans rather than resist, now saw that resistance was possible. The Republic's faith in Alexander was vindicated. For the Livonian order, the defeat at Lake Peipus was a catastrophe. Their expansion into Russian territories halted immediately. Fortress garrisons pulled back to more defensible positions. The dream of conquering Novgorod and opening the Orthodox lands to Catholic domination evaporated. Over the following months, diplomats from the order would negotiate a peace treaty, unceding territory and recognizing the Neva River and Lake Peipus as the boundary between their domains and Novgorod's sphere. It was not a crushing surrender, but it was a retreat, the first significant setback the order had faced in decades of conquest. Alexander himself would go on to navigate an even more dangerous frontier, managing relations with the Mongol Empire, which held dominion over much of Russia. But on that April day in 1242, he had secured the western border, held the gate against the Crusaders, and ensured that Novgorod would remain free. His soldiers, exhausted and cold, made camp on the eastern shore of Lake Peipus, building fires against the lingering chill of early spring. Some ventured back onto the ice to recover more equipment, though they moved cautiously, testing every step, acutely aware of the treachery beneath, for the lake still held bodies. In some places, the ice had refrozen over the gaps, sealing the dead beneath a transparent tomb. In others, broken armor and weapons lay half submerged in frigid water. Historians in later centuries would debate the details. How many knights truly fell through the ice? Whether the breaking was as dramatic as legend claimed, or whether it was simply the psychological shock of seeing comrades disappear that broke the order's will. But to the men who had been there, who had heard the crack and seen the water swallow armored men whole, there was no debate. The ice had fought for Novgorod that day. As night fell, the wind picked up across the lake, cold and sharp. carrying with it the memory of what had happened here. The western shore lay empty now. The knights fled or dead, their banners trampled into the blood-stained ice. The eastern shore flickered with Russian campfires, voices rising in prayer and weary celebration. Between them, the frozen expanse stretched dark and silent, holding its secrets beneath the surface. Prince Alexander Yaroslavich stood at the water's edge one last time before retiring to his tent. Behind him, Novgorod remained free. Ahead, across the ice, the shadows of the Western Crusade retreated into the forests and fortresses from which they had come. The gate had held. The lake had claimed its price. And when the dawn came, the survivors would march home, carrying with them the knowledge that even the mightiest armies could be broken if you knew the ground, trusted your strategy, and let the land itself become your ally. The battle was over. The lake fell silent, and in the cold April darkness, the ice slowly began its long, inevitable thaw.